When Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was finally sentenced to life behind the reinforced walls of a United States supermax prison, many observers believed they were witnessing the end of an era and the collapse of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in modern history. For decades, his name had been synonymous with the Sinaloa Cartel, a network that stretched across continents, moved vast quantities of narcotics, and reshaped the balance of power within organized crime. His dramatic escapes, his recapture, and ultimately his extradition to the United States seemed like the climax of a long saga that revolved around a single dominant figure. In the public imagination, the cartel and its leader were inseparable. Remove the king, and the kingdom would surely fall. Yet what followed defied that expectation. Instead of imploding under the weight of leadership loss, the organization adapted. Rather than fragmenting into irrelevance, it recalibrated. And instead of relying on a singular, charismatic authority, it quietly shifted toward a more distributed structure that would redefine how modern criminal enterprises survive in an era of relentless international pressure. The story of how the Sinaloa Cartel endured after the fall of El Chapo is not a tale of simple succession. It is a study in organizational resilience, strategic decentralization, and the evolution of illicit networks in the 21st century. To understand how the organization survived, it is essential to look beyond the personality of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán and examine the foundations that were built long before his imprisonment. Although he became the most recognizable face of the cartel, he was never its sole architect. The Sinaloa network was shaped by alliances between veteran traffickers, regional power brokers, and family-based factions that operated with a shared interest in profit and influence. Even during El Chapo's peak years of visibility, decision-making was rarely as centralized as media narratives suggested. Power flowed through a constellation of trusted lieutenants, logistical coordinators, financial operators, and territorial commanders. This embedded structure meant that when law enforcement removed one leader, the system did not simply vanish, it absorbed the shock. Years of operating under pressure had already conditioned the organization to expect arrests, extraditions, and betrayals. In that environment, redundancy was not optional, it was a survival mechanism. The period immediately following El Chapo's final capture created a vacuum in public perception, but internally, the cartel had already been preparing for contingency scenarios. Key figures stepped forward, not necessarily as absolute rulers, but as influential nodes within a broader network. Some factions were linked to long-standing partners who had shared power for decades. Others represented the next generation, individuals who had grown up within the organization and understood both its traditions and its vulnerabilities. Instead of crowning a single successor, influence became more distributed. Authority was negotiated, shared, and sometimes contested. This shift reduced the risks associated with concentrating control in one highly visible individual. From a strategic standpoint, decentralization made the organization more difficult to dismantle. If one faction faced targeted enforcement, others could continue operating, preserving revenue streams and territorial footholds. This transformation reflected a broader trend within organized crime. As governments improved intelligence sharing, surveillance capabilities, and cross-border cooperation, traditional hierarchies became liabilities. High-profile leaders attracted attention. Their communications were monitored, their movements tracked, and their inner circles infiltrated. By contrast, a flatter network offered resilience. Cells could operate semi-independently while aligning around shared objectives. Financial channels could be diversified across regions and intermediaries. Supply chains could be rerouted quickly when pressure intensified along a particular corridor. In this context, the survival of the Sinaloa Cartel was not merely about replacing El Chapo. It was about evolving into a structure less vulnerable to decapitation strategies. Leadership transitions, however, were not without tension. Distributed power can stabilize an organization, but it can also generate rivalry. After El Chapo's removal, competing interests emerged among influential factions. Some sought to consolidate authority and assert dominance over strategic territories. Others prioritized maintaining cooperative arrangements that had historically reduced internal violence. These dynamics shaped the cartel's internal politics in subtle but significant ways. Decision-making became a balancing act between collaboration and competition. Alliances formed around shared family ties, business interests, and geographic control. In some regions, commanders negotiated local arrangements to prevent fragmentation. In others, disputes over routes and revenues triggered episodes of confrontation. The organization's ability to manage these tensions without descending into total collapse became a defining feature of its post-El Chapo era. Another crucial factor in the cartel's endurance was its economic adaptability. Over time, the organization had diversified its revenue streams beyond a narrow focus on a single substance or market. It operated along multiple trafficking routes, connecting production zones, transit corridors, and consumer destinations across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. This diversification reduced dependence on any single pathway. When enforcement pressure intensified along one border crossing, alternative routes could be activated. When demand shifted in one region, distribution networks in another could compensate. Such flexibility mirrored the risk management strategies of multinational corporations that hedge against market volatility. While the products and activities differed drastically in legality and ethics, the structural logic of diversification remained comparable. Technological adaptation also played a role in sustaining operations. As communication tools evolved, so did methods of coordination. Encrypted messaging platforms, compartmentalized information sharing, and rotating intermediaries became standard practices within many sophisticated criminal networks. These techniques limited exposure and contained damage when arrests occurred. Financial operations likewise grew more complex, incorporating layers of intermediaries to obscure transactions and reduce traceability. The organization did not rely solely on traditional cash smuggling. It adjusted to a globalized financial environment that demanded agility and discretion. Such modernization underscored a key reality. Survival depended not on nostalgia for past methods, but on continuous adaptation. Territorial management inside Mexico presented another layer of complexity. The Sinaloa Cartel historically maintained influence in key regions that functioned as production hubs, transit corridors, and logistical centers. After El Chapo's imprisonment, maintaining stability in these territories required careful coordination. Local commanders had to balance relationships with communities, manage rival threats, and ensure that revenue continued to flow upward through agreed channels. Too much central interference risked alienating regional leaders. Too little oversight risked fragmentation. The distributed model that emerged allowed local actors a degree of autonomy while preserving overarching alignment with broader strategic objectives. In effect, the organization operated more like a federation of semi-autonomous units than a rigid pyramid. Internationally, the cartel's network-based structure proved equally advantageous. Partnerships with foreign intermediaries, transport specialists, and distribution networks were often based on mutual benefit rather than strict subordination. These relationships could continue even if leadership in Mexico shifted. Buyers and partners were primarily concerned with reliability of supply, consistency of pricing, and predictability of transactions. As long as those factors remained stable, the identity of the ultimate leader was secondary. By prioritizing continuity in logistics and communication, the organization reassured its external partners that business would proceed despite high-profile arrests. Public perception, however, lagged behind this internal reality. Media narratives often center on personalities because they are easier to dramatize. El Chapo's story fit that model perfectly. Dramatic escapes, extravagant lifestyle, and courtroom spectacle. Yet focusing solely on one individual obscured the systemic nature of the organization. When he was removed, headlines predicted imminent disintegration. Instead, the cartel's endurance demonstrated that it functioned less like a monarchy and more like a complex enterprise with layers of management and contingency planning. The myth of singular control gave way to the reality of collective strategy. At the same time, the post-El Chapo era revealed generational shifts. Younger leaders, having observed the vulnerabilities of flamboyant visibility, adopted lower profiles. They prioritized operational security over public notoriety. This change reflected lessons learned from years of aggressive law enforcement targeting high-profile figures. Visibility became a liability rather than an asset. By minimizing exposure, the new leadership model sought to extend longevity and reduce the risk of coordinated crackdowns. The emphasis moved from cultivating legend to preserving structure. The resilience of the Sinaloa Cartel after El Chapo's life sentence also illustrates a broader principle in organizational theory. Systems built around networks rather than individuals are harder to dismantle. When authority is distributed, redundancy becomes embedded. Knowledge is shared across nodes rather than concentrated in a single command center. This does not eliminate vulnerability, but it complicates efforts to achieve decisive disruption. Law enforcement agencies have increasingly recognized this challenge, adjusting strategies to focus not only on leaders but also on financial flows, supply chains, and interfactional dynamics. The contest between enforcement and adaptation continues to evolve, shaping the environment in which such organizations operate. Ultimately, the survival of the Sinaloa Cartel after the imprisonment of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was not an accident of timing or luck. It was the product of years of structural evolution, diversification, and strategic foresight. By transitioning from a model perceived as leader-centric to one grounded in distributed influence, the organization reduced its dependence on any single figure. Internal rivalries did not disappear, but they were managed within a framework that prioritized collective survival over individual dominance. Economic diversification, technological adaptation, and territorial flexibility reinforced this resilience. What emerged was not a weakened remnant clinging to past glory, but a recalibrated network operating under new constraints. The era of El Chapo as the dominant symbol may have ended, but the organization he helped shape demonstrated that its foundations ran deeper than any one name. As the dust settled after Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was permanently removed from the operational landscape, the true test for the Sinaloa Cartel was not whether it could continue moving product, but whether it could manage power without collapsing into internal war. History had shown that criminal organizations often fracture when a dominant leader disappears. Rival lieutenants compete for supremacy, alliances dissolve, and violence spirals in ways that attract even more law enforcement pressure. The Sinaloa network understood this risk intimately because it had witnessed similar implosions among competing groups. Survival in this new era required more than decentralized logistics. It required a recalibration of authority itself. Instead of replacing one king with another, the organization leaned further into a system where influence was shared among key factions, each controlling specific territories, supply lines, and operational specialties. This distribution of power created tension, but it also introduced a form of internal checks and balances that paradoxically reduced the likelihood of total fragmentation. At the center of this evolving structure were factions tied to long-standing family networks and generational successors. Some figures were veterans who had operated alongside El Chapo for decades, individuals whose authority derived from experience, reputation, and established relationships across trafficking corridors. Others represented a younger generation that had grown up observing both the successes and the mistakes of their predecessors. These younger leaders were acutely aware that excessive visibility could invite catastrophic consequences. Rather than seeking media notoriety, they focused on quiet consolidation, digital coordination, and careful management of alliances. Their approach reflected a shift in priorities from symbolic dominance to operational durability. Power struggles did not vanish in this new configuration. On the contrary, competition simmered beneath the surface. Certain factions sought to expand territorial control, especially in strategically valuable border regions and coastal zones that facilitated international shipments. Disputes over revenue distribution, local command appointments, and access to production hubs occasionally erupted into confrontation. However, unlike a rigid hierarchy where the death or arrest of the leader would leave a vacuum, the distributed system meant that conflicts were often contained within defined boundaries. Factions negotiated truces, mediated disagreements through intermediaries, and weighed the economic costs of prolonged internal warfare. In many cases, the calculus favored stability. Sustained infighting risked attracting attention from both domestic authorities and international partners who depended on consistent supply chains. This pragmatic orientation toward business continuity became a defining feature of the cartel's post-El Chapo phase. The organization increasingly resembled a federation of semi-autonomous divisions linked by shared interests rather than unquestioned obedience. Each major faction maintained its own network of local commanders, security personnel, transport specialists, and financial operators. Yet they remained interconnected through overlapping family ties, mutual defense arrangements, and collective investment in transnational logistics. The structure allowed for flexibility. If one division encountered intense enforcement pressure in a specific region, others could adjust routes or temporarily absorb distribution responsibilities. Such adaptability reduced systemic risk and preserved the broader enterprise. The internal politics of this arrangement required careful management. Trust was both essential and fragile. To maintain cooperation, leading figures often relied on long-established personal bonds reinforced by kinship and shared history. These relationships functioned as informal contracts that discouraged betrayal. At the same time, the organization adopted compartmentalization strategies to limit exposure. Information about shipments, financial transfers, and strategic plans was distributed on a need-to-know basis. This reduced the damage if an individual was arrested or defected. Compartmentalization also prevented any single actor from holding all operational knowledge, reinforcing the principle that no one person was indispensable. The evolution of the cartel's leadership structure also influenced how it interacted with local communities and regional authorities. Historically, influence in certain territories depended not only on coercion, but also on a complex mix of patronage, economic integration, and social presence. In the absence of a single dominant figure, regional commanders had greater discretion to manage these relationships according to local conditions. Some prioritized maintaining a lower profile to avoid provoking federal crackdowns. Others emphasized economic incentives, ensuring that local populations benefited indirectly from the stability of trafficking operations. While these dynamics are controversial and often morally fraught, they form part of the pragmatic strategy aimed at sustaining long-term control rather than pursuing short-term spectacle. Internationally, the cartel's decentralized leadership made coordination more intricate but also more resilient. Global trafficking routes spanning North America, parts of Europe, and Asia required synchronization across production zones, maritime transport, air routes, and land corridors. Instead of a single executive authority dictating every move, regional leaders collaborated through trusted intermediaries and encrypted communication channels. Decisions about pricing, shipment timing, and risk mitigation were often negotiated rather than imposed. This collaborative approach resembled strategic alliances between corporate divisions operating in different markets. Each faction retained autonomy while aligning with shared objectives, particularly the preservation of profitable corridors and the minimization of disruption. Financial management further reflected this corporate-style evolution. Diversification extended beyond routes to encompass revenue streams and laundering mechanisms. Investments were spread across various channels to reduce dependence on any one method. The organization incorporated layers of intermediaries and front operations to obscure the origins of funds and protect senior figures from direct exposure. Risk assessment became an ongoing process, with leadership evaluating enforcement trends, technological developments, and geopolitical shifts that could affect supply chains. The emphasis on strategic foresight marked a departure from purely reactive tactics. It signaled an awareness that longevity required anticipating pressure rather than merely responding to it. At the same time, the balance of power among factions was never static. Periodic arrests of mid-level commanders reshaped alliances and opened space for emerging actors. Some regions experienced shifts in loyalty as local leaders recalculated their affiliations. These fluctuations created moments of uncertainty that tested the stability of the network. Yet the overarching structure proved adaptable enough to absorb these shocks. When a commander was removed, successors were often prepared in advance. The distributed model ensured that institutional knowledge persisted even when individuals were lost. The generational dimension of leadership also introduced subtle cultural changes within the organization. Younger figures, having grown up in an era of digital surveillance and globalized markets, approached operations with a different mindset than their predecessors. They were less inclined to cultivate public mythologies and more focused on operational secrecy. They invested in technology that enhanced coordination while minimizing traceability. They studied enforcement patterns across multiple countries, recognizing that pressure in one jurisdiction could ripple across the entire network. This strategic awareness reinforced the shift from personality-driven leadership to system-driven management. Rival organizations continued to challenge Sinaloa's influence in various territories, and these external pressures indirectly shaped internal cohesion. The existence of powerful competitors created incentives for factions within the cartel to maintain at least a baseline of cooperation. Prolonged internal warfare would weaken their collective position and invite encroachment. Therefore, even when tensions flared, there was often a shared understanding that certain red lines should not be crossed. This pragmatic restraint did not eliminate violence, but it contributed to the overall endurance of the enterprise. The post-El Chapo era also highlighted the limitations of decapitation strategies in combating large criminal networks. While the arrest and conviction of a high-profile leader can disrupt operations temporarily and send a symbolic message, it does not automatically dismantle the underlying infrastructure. In the case of the Sinaloa Cartel, years of institutional development had embedded resilience into its core. Removing a central figure altered the configuration of power, but did not erase the logistical expertise, financial channels, and international relationships that had been cultivated over decades. The organization's ability to transition from charismatic centralization to distributed governance demonstrated that adaptability was deeply ingrained. Within this evolving framework, legitimacy among members derived less from personal legend and more from effectiveness. Leaders were evaluated on their capacity to maintain profitable routes, manage conflicts, and shield subordinates from excessive exposure. Success was measured by continuity rather than spectacle. This shift in criteria influenced recruitment, promotion, and alliance formation. Individuals who demonstrated discretion, strategic thinking, and loyalty to collective interests gained prominence. The emphasis on professionalized management further aligned the organization's internal culture with corporate analogies, albeit within an illicit context. As the second phase of the cartel's transformation unfolded, it became clear that survival hinged on a delicate equilibrium. Too much fragmentation would invite collapse. Too much centralization would recreate the vulnerabilities associated with a single dominant leader. The distributed model navigated this tension by allowing multiple centers of influence to coexist under a shared economic umbrella. Power was negotiated rather than absolute. Alliances were pragmatic rather than ideological, and strategy was guided by risk assessment rather than ego. In this landscape, the legacy of El Chapo remained influential but no longer singular. His era had shaped the organization's expansion and global reach, yet the lessons learned from his capture informed its subsequent evolution. The network that emerged after his imprisonment was leaner in public visibility, more cautious in communication, and more complex in governance. It functioned less like a pyramid and more like an interconnected web, capable of bending under pressure without snapping entirely. The transformation did not signal the end of conflict or controversy, but it underscored a central reality of modern organized crime. Resilience is often rooted in structure, not in personality. Ultimately, the survival of the Sinaloa Cartel after the imprisonment of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was not an accident of timing or luck. It was the product of years of structural evolution, diversification, and strategic foresight. By transitioning from a model perceived as leader-centric to one grounded in distributed influence, the organization reduced its dependence on any single figure. Internal rivalries did not disappear, but they were managed within a framework that prioritized collective survival over individual dominance. Economic diversification, technological adaptation, and territorial flexibility reinforced this resilience. What emerged was not a weakened remnant clinging to past glory, but a recalibrated network operating under new constraints. The era of El Chapo as the dominant symbol may have ended, but the organization he helped shape demonstrated that its foundations ran deeper than any one name. What ultimately defines the post-El Chapo era is not simply that the Sinaloa Cartel survived, but how it reimagined survival itself in a world where pressure is constant. Borders are monitored with increasing sophistication, and financial systems are scrutinized at a global scale. The organization's transformation reflects a broader shift in the architecture of modern illicit enterprises, where flexibility is valued over spectacle and sustainability outweighs symbolic dominance. In the years following the imprisonment of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the cartel did not retreat into obscurity, nor did it attempt to recreate the exact model that had defined his reign. Instead, it refined a strategy built on adaptability, diversification, and calculated invisibility, embedding these principles deeply into its operations. One of the most significant aspects of this transformation has been the refinement of logistical strategy. Trafficking networks in the 21st century operate within a complex web of international regulations, maritime surveillance, aerial monitoring, and intelligence sharing agreements between governments. In such an environment, static routes quickly become liabilities. The Sinaloa network responded by emphasizing fluidity. Land corridors were rotated, maritime pathways adjusted, and partnerships recalibrated according to enforcement intensity. The goal was not merely to move product from one point to another, but to design a system that could reconfigure itself rapidly when obstacles emerged. This approach mirrors supply chain management practices in legitimate multinational corporations, where contingency planning is essential to withstand geopolitical shifts or market disruptions. The cartel's network-based structure enabled it to execute these adjustments without waiting for centralized approval, empowering regional actors to act decisively within agreed strategic parameters. Financial strategy also evolved in tandem with logistical innovation. The increasing digitization of global finance has created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for illicit networks. On one hand, electronic transactions and cross-border capital flows offer speed and scale. On the other, they leave digital footprints. In response, the organization layered its financial operations across multiple jurisdictions and intermediaries, reducing the traceability of funds and distributing risk. Revenue was diversified not only across different substances, but across different markets, minimizing reliance on any single region's demand patterns. Such diversification created buffers against sudden policy changes or enforcement surges in specific countries. The emphasis on financial resilience reinforced the broader principle that no single point of failure should threaten the entire enterprise. Technology has further reshaped operational culture. Encrypted communication platforms, compartmentalized data sharing, and the strategic use of intermediaries became integral to maintaining secrecy. The organization invested in minimizing digital exposure while leveraging technological tools for coordination. Information flows were tightly controlled, and leadership structures emphasized need-to-know access. This digital discipline reduced the impact of arrests by ensuring that detained individuals possessed only limited knowledge of broader operations. The network's capacity to function, even when segments were disrupted, illustrated the practical advantages of decentralization in an age of surveillance. At the same time, internal governance required ongoing calibration. Distributed power does not eliminate ambition, and the coexistence of influential factions necessitated mechanisms for conflict management. Informal councils, negotiated truces, and shared economic incentives played roles in maintaining cohesion. The organization's leadership recognized that prolonged internal warfare would erode profits, destabilize territories, and invite intensified enforcement. Therefore, strategic restraint often prevailed over impulsive escalation. While tensions occasionally surfaced, the overarching commitment to collective survival acted as a moderating force. This pragmatic orientation distinguished the cartel's modern phase from earlier periods characterized by more overt power struggles. Territorial dynamics within Mexico continued to influence the organization's trajectory. Certain regions remained critical for production, storage, and transit, and maintaining stability in these areas required nuanced engagement with local realities. Regional commanders operated with a blend of autonomy and accountability, adapting strategies to local conditions while aligning with broader network objectives. This semi-autonomous model allowed for rapid responses to shifts in rival activity or enforcement pressure. It also fostered a sense of localized responsibility, as commanders understood that their performance directly affected their standing within the wider network. The distributed governance model thus created incentives for operational competence at multiple levels. Externally, relationships with international partners were shaped by reliability rather than personality. Buyers and intermediaries prioritized consistent supply chains and predictable terms over allegiance to a specific leader. By ensuring continuity despite leadership transitions, the Sinaloa network reinforced its reputation as a stable supplier. In global illicit markets, reliability functions as currency. Maintaining that reliability required meticulous coordination across continents, reinforcing the importance of communication infrastructure and trust-based partnerships. The organization's ability to project stability in the aftermath of a high-profile conviction demonstrated the depth of its institutionalization. Another defining feature of this era has been the cultivation of a lower public profile. The flamboyance that once characterized certain leaders became widely recognized as a strategic vulnerability. Visibility attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny generates risk. The new generation of leadership internalized this lesson. Public displays of wealth were tempered, communication was disciplined, and operational discretion became a hallmark of the network. This cultural shift signaled a move away from myth-making and toward managerial pragmatism. The emphasis was on longevity rather than legend. The broader implications of this evolution extend beyond a single organization. The endurance of the Sinaloa Cartel after the fall of El Chapo illustrates the limitations of strategies that focus exclusively on removing high-profile figures. While such arrests carry symbolic and tactical significance, they do not automatically dismantle complex systems built on decentralized networks and diversified revenue streams. The contest between enforcement agencies and organized crime increasingly resembles an adaptive cycle, where each innovation on one side prompts recalibration on the other. In this dynamic environment, resilience depends on structural flexibility more than individual charisma. It is also important to recognize that adaptability does not equate to invulnerability. Distributed systems can fracture under sustained pressure, and internal rivalries can intensify under strain. The very autonomy that grants flexibility can also create divergent interests. Economic shocks, technological breakthroughs in surveillance, or shifts in geopolitical alliances could reshape the landscape again. The Sinaloa network's survival thus far reflects strategic evolution, but it does not guarantee perpetual dominance. Rather, it highlights the ongoing interplay between organization, environment, and adaptation. The modern cartel model increasingly mirrors certain characteristics of multinational enterprises, albeit operating outside legal frameworks. Strategic planning, risk assessment, diversification, supply chain optimization, and decentralized management have become central pillars. These elements contribute to durability in the face of uncertainty. The shift from a personality-driven narrative to a systems-driven reality underscores the importance of understanding organized crime as an institutional phenomenon rather than a collection of isolated actors. When observers focus solely on individual leaders, they risk underestimating the depth and adaptability of the structures beneath them. As the years pass since El Chapo's sentencing, the story of the Sinaloa Cartel continues to evolve. New leaders emerge, alliances shift, and enforcement strategies adapt. Yet the central lesson remains consistent. Organizations that anticipate disruption and design themselves for flexibility are more likely to endure. By decentralizing authority, diversifying operations, and prioritizing operational security, the cartel redefined its internal architecture. The result was not a dramatic collapse, but a strategic transformation. In the end, the survival of the Sinaloa Cartel after the imprisonment of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán is less about the endurance of a name and more about the resilience of a structure. It reveals how modern illicit networks can absorb shocks, redistribute authority, and continue functioning under intense scrutiny. The narrative challenges simplistic assumptions about leadership and power, demonstrating that in complex systems, influence is rarely confined to a single individual. Instead, it flows through interconnected nodes, sustained by shared incentives and adaptive strategy. Understanding this evolution is essential for grasping the broader dynamics of contemporary organized crime. The shift toward decentralized governance, corporate-style management, and strategic invisibility represents a significant development in how such networks operate. It underscores the need for equally adaptive approaches in response. The story is ongoing, shaped by innovation, competition, and the constant pressure of enforcement. What remains clear is that the fall of a single leader did not mark the end of the organization, but the beginning of a new chapter defined by calculated transformation. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.